接下来我们进入下一个 panel， 也是我们上午预告过的一位非常重磅的嘉宾，来自拥有21年顶尖餐饮品牌和供应商服务经验的老牌数据市场公司 Datassential 这20多年来一直为餐饮及供应链行业提供兼具广度和深度的数据报告、市场策略分析、菜单定制，还有原材料管理方案等等非常多的服务。我们所熟知的很多美国一线的餐饮和供应链品牌都通过 Datassential数以百万计的数据库来制定过公司的战略和发展方向。那么从去年疫情一开始呢 Datassential 就通过每周的 webinar 为餐饮从业者提供及时的数据和市场分析。那么接下来让我们有请 Ian O'Neill。Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ian O'Neill from Datassential.
Thank you. I'm sure everyone is just like falling out of their chairs, clapping so hard virtually.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, please go ahead.
I'll get some.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Anyhow, so like Henry said, first of all, I want to thank Shiho for inviting me here. And thank you to Calvin and Henry, Vio, Cosmo, everyone who's kind of helped set this up. I know there's other people that I don't even know that are probably helping set this up. So Datassential has been around for about 15 years, and we supply research insights to pretty much everyone in the industry. So I work with national restaurant chains, as well as food manufacturers to help understand consumer insights, to understand what's trending on menus. And we use a number of different tools in our data set to look at that information, right? So the data that I'm going to show you is consumer-based information, primarily in the United States. And you'll see throughout this presentation, we'll talk about some real mega trends, some big things affecting different demographics in the United States. And I think we'll touch a lot on younger generations like Gen Z and millennials, because they are the next line of consumers. So, you know, the most important consumer is your next consumer or customer. So your next customer is probably going to be someone like millennial, Gen Z. And I think that's really bodes well for the Chinese restaurant industry specifically. But they do think about brands and food differently. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll move into some more specific things related to delivery, COVID, Asian food as a whole. Now, Chinese food specifically plays a role within that. But a lot of times US consumers think of Asian food in a big chunk. But we'll try to parse that out as we go through further into the presentation. Feel free to send any notes or questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them. I can't promise I will. But if we have time, we will. So with that, I think we can kind of jump in and move on to the next slide. You know, we're going to talk about the general landscape. I kind of covered that already. It's changing. You know, with every generation, it becomes a little different. So the big change here is migration, right? There's changing demographics in the United States. So if we look at, you know, National Geographic did a thing to say, what is the consumer, what is the American going to look like, you know, 30 years, 40 years from now? And they showed a lot of pictures of artists that did a rendering of people look like this, right? It's kind of this melting pot theory that people will kind of, you know, look more global, right? From all over the world as different generations change. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the breakdown between, you know, traditionally white consumers in America for the boomer generation is around 72% versus 28%. And Gen Z is actually the most diverse group of consumers of any generation before it. And what does that mean? That means they've been exposed probably to more types of foods than any other generation before them. And the barrier to try new things is a lot lower for that generation. So we said, you know, what does this mean for food, right? Does kind of these different experiences at each generational level, does that impact food? So we looked at it and we said, okay, this is affinity or interest, liking for American food by generation. And you can see that boomers are the most interested in American food. The least interested is Gen Z, right? And then as we go down, we can see the next slide is Southern food. Now this is Southern United States food, right? Regional food in America. And again, we see that slide, kind of the chart precipitously fall from left to right. Boomers the most interested, with younger generations being the less interested. Now we thought, okay, maybe just younger generations hate everything. So we tested out a number of different global cuisines to see what the interest level was. And what we see is that interest level actually flips. So we said, you know, what's your interest in Korean food? Or on the next slide, Vietnamese food? or Indian food. And we did this for a number of different global foods, and the same pattern emerged as you can see here, right? With the more interest being with younger generations who are more diverse, who maybe have had a friend that's Indian, or that's Chinese, and their parents, maybe they go to their house to play video games, and their friend's mom makes something like roti, or maybe a more traditional preparation of Chinese food, and so they understand what that is, and they're less scared to try new things. So the idea that a small change in the demographics can really trigger this major shift in the general population and what they like food. Now, if we look at generational interest about food, right? So would you try this food to understand, would you just try this because it looks good, you want the taste to be good, or just try it because it's new? And you can see here that younger generations are much more likely to try things just because it's new, right? Just because it's new, not because it's just new for new sake. So the taste is more important to Gen X and boomers than it is to millennials and Gen Z, showing us that, hey, they're more open just to try anything that's new and a fun experience. Now, these perceptions also span into, and I pulled some national brands here because we track what consumers think about these brands. Now, these feelings, these different feelings towards trying new foods and their perception of food also bleeds into the idea of affordability versus value for the dollar. Now, what does that mean, right? So this affordability being, hey, McDonald's, KFC, Del Taco, these are really cheap. It's $1. They said, hey, this isn't something that's affordable. But younger generations, this is Gen Z's interest across the span here. The value for the dollar, they still felt that even though they're going to pay $4 for Starbucks versus a $1 coffee McDonald's, they still felt like that was the value at Starbucks because they really provided a best-in-class service. So, if we looked at older generations, they would have said, all of these brands must have been on the left-hand side, and they're like, hey, these are affordable, but it's not worth the value of a $5 Starbucks. But Gen Z says, hey, no, these brands for $1 are affordable, but these brands over here that serve a more premium product are valuable. And the way that I like to think about this is Gen X is more into exclusive things, right? We've got a Louis Vuitton, or I'm not very familiar with all these handbags, but a very expensive exclusive handbag, right? Where millennials are more likely to be interested in an authentic experience, if you will, while Gen Z is more interested in a very, unique experience. So, if you think about older generations, they're more interested in maybe like, joining a country club or buying a jet ski, while younger generations, it's more experiential. They want something that's a unique experience that, a famous comedian did a pop-up shop where he served pancakes, and, there was only 50 people that got to go. It's a very unique experience. That interests younger generations more than these very expensive things. Not saying that they don't love some of those expensive things, but the idea is that more of them care about this unique experience, probably for social media platforms and things like that, so they can share it with people. So it's an interesting distinction between those generations. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about COVID and delivery. And I think delivery is really important to Chinese food, and I'll talk about that in a second. But 90% of consumers have actually changed their delivery behavior as a result of COVID. Okay, so what does change mean? Does that mean order less, order more variety? And we'll get into that. So on the next slide, we'll see that across every single demographic, the majority of people have been ordering more delivery. And this was fielded, I think, right around the middle of 2021, so probably about 5 months ago. And we see that everyone says, hey, look, I'm ordering more than ever. And just a couple questions I'm seeing here about the survey data. I think that was probably in relation to maybe a slide or two ago, but all this data is at least, from 2020 or earlier, and we always sample with a robust enough sample size that it is reliable. So if it's representative of the United States or of a generation, we make sure that we've got enough people answering to make that claim. So you can rely on this data. So if we look at this next slide, right? So everyone's increasing their ordering patterns, but what cuisine types are they ordering? And I think this is where it gets interesting for Chinese restaurants. So it's always been pizza as the thing in consumers' mind of like, this travels well, this is a good thing to order. And then you'll see number 2 is Chinese food. So pizza, then Chinese food, these are the things that people think travel well. And I think if you look historically, this has probably kind of been in consumers' mind of like the 1-2 punch. 1 pizza, 2 Chinese food as something that inherently travels well. And I think Chinese food actually has done a great job of maybe branding itself as delivering well. The packaging is really good. I think a lot of burger places do really poor on the packaging and it shows up. I mean, some of that is inherent to the food. Others, they could probably do better with the packaging. Every time I order Chinese food, I'm always surprised at how hot it is when it gets there. The soup is like tied up in 4 bags. I think you guys in the industry has done a great job regarding, convincing people that travels well, because burritos travel well, but they've really not been messaged that way. So it's not just what inherently travels well, but what is kind of this perception of what travels well. On the next slide, we'll see what people have ordered in the last month. So we can actually see, because of COVID, now this is during COVID that we got this data, right? And this was fielded somewhere around March of this year. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of other competitors now, right? It used to be, well, when we're going to order delivery, we're going to get pizza, and we're going to get Chinese food. Now we've got the entire menu because of third party, because of a lot of other factors, people staying at home, being afraid to leave, some of the restaurants being shut down. Now they basically have a whole wide array. So we're not just competing with pizza anymore. We're competing against the entire, from Thai food to burgers to fries to, you name it. Anything with a swipe of your thumb, you could pretty much get on demand. So before it was like you maybe had a pizza menu on your refrigerator and you had a Chinese food takeout menu on your refrigerator and you called those in. Now people are using third party and there's a lot more competition. So that's definitely something to keep our eye on. And if we look again at the next slide, what's the preferred way for consumers to order this food? We see that boomers are more likely to call in, right? And what's funny about this is you can see Gen Z is actually, it says prefer to order by phone. And when we dug into this data, we actually found with some of the open-ended responses that Gen Z thought that when we said order by phone, they meant just text it, not call. So when we actually see that go up, that's because they assumed they were talking about, getting on their iPhone and ordering it through a third party or, through an app or something. So older generations much more interested in actually picking up the phone and calling. The next level of generation is interested in being able they don't really want to talk to someone on the phone. They would rather just punch it in and either pick it up or get it delivered. And then the next slide, what are some frustrations? So we've talked about, all right, the landscape of options is changing. Looking at, the method of ordering, younger generations prefer some sort of app. Older generations prefer to call. What's the expectation around the general annoyance of when you order food? And so consumers say, if it's 33 minutes or less, that's kind of acceptable. Where they start to get annoyed is right around that 47-minute mark, right? And this will depend market to market, I'm sure, on a Friday night versus a Wednesday night. But generally speaking, this is kind of, an average of expectation and annoyance. So that kind of shores up the first section of those mega trends of changing tastes and also just changing preference regarding food, global influence, and then also delivery habits and the way that people interact with different brands. So now we'll move into global cuisine and U.S. consumers specifically. So again, we're going to kind of get a little more closer into home here. So, what is some of the things that are a barrier for people when they're ordering global food? This came from a keynote that we did within the last year or so, last 12 months. And one of the biggest barriers for people was that I just don't know how to make global food. Now, when we defined global food in this study, we talked about, European, African, Asian, South American. Those are kind of the big buckets that we talked about. And so when most people said, I don't know, that's actually a good thing, I think, for the Chinese restaurant industry. A lot of American consumers just don't know how to make this at home unless, they grew up with it. I think that's probably true of most cuisines. If you grew up in a home where, a certain dish was prepared, you would know how to do it. So that's kind of the big barrier And I think that's a good thing for our industry is that, hey, not a lot of people are making this stuff at home and they feel like they can only get it at other restaurants. So that's the barrier. What's the other side of it? On the next slide, we'll see what would make you choose food service. So you can see this person is enjoying their noodles in the tub. And so what would make them choose food service? So we're actually seeing that 43% of people are saying, hey, these are dishes I can't easily make. That's why I'm not going to make them at home. Also variety. I only have so much food in my pantry. I'm going to, there's no way that I can make this unless I went out or bought a lot of ingredients. And then the third thing, looking at restaurant quality, right? So this idea that it's hard to make at home and there's a lot of variety and it's quality food. These are kind of the top three things. This is kind of common sense, but it's cool to see it laid out here in the data that these are the reasons why people do it. Now, the fourth one here, try something new and exciting. That's another interesting piece because I think if you're going to get food at, at home or at the grocery store, you're not getting something new or exciting. You're more likely to get something new or exciting at a restaurant. So that's something to think about as we come, not everything on the menu has to be new and exciting, but maybe, is there a way that a seasonal limited time offer could get people excited and maybe get a few extra people in the door? That's definitely a possibility. So new and exciting is definitely one of those things maybe to think about is 35% of consumers say that that would be something that would make me go out of my house and get food. So to switch gears, not really switching gears, but looking at a framework that we provide called the menu adoption cycle. So this is 4 stages. And if you think about this in terms of awareness, the first is inception. This is going to start at fine dining, small, maybe food truck type restaurants with globally influenced. And then the next stage is adoption. It's a little more chef forward. And still, you're probably using ingredients or foods that are a little less known to the broader general population. Something that is in the proliferation stage is probably going to be something that you could find at a Chili's or TGI Fridays at casual dining. And something that's in ubiquity is probably like ketchup. Everybody knows what ketchup is. It's not exciting. I think of these in 2 halves. The second half, proliferation and ubiquity, that's going to drive value. Everybody knows what fried rice is. That's going to be, not that crazy. Pretty much you're going to find everybody almost everybody knows what that is. Something that is like a Peking duck, that maybe be something more in adoption. It's going to be more niche. Not everybody knows what that is, but the people that do will go out of their way to go get it. So that's going to drive the excitement. So if we look at this in practice about global cuisine types, so looking at all different global cuisine types on the next slide, we'll see that Chinese food people are pretty much aware of what Chinese food is. And you can see that in brown on the right-hand side. We see Chinese food along with Mexican, Italian. These are basic foods that pretty much 99% of Americans have had this at some point. They know what it is. But on the left-hand side, that's more niche. A reminder, Chinese food, you're going to get a lot of value for that type of food. Regional Chinese food, that's a little more exciting. The people, not everybody knows what that is. Not everyone knows what Cantonese or Szechuan. But the people that do get really excited and they go out of their way to get it. So I think this is an interesting way to see kind of how Chinese food stacks up against global cuisine. And, I think largely speaking, we are seeing more and more regional influence and people, especially younger consumers, being more interested in some of those call outs of regional influence, not just Chinese food, but a specific, Cantonese or style of food. So on to the next slide here. Thinking about global cuisine, I think this is, a pretty cool thing to see that Asian cuisine is basically loved by almost all generations. And the difference here, and again, this is including everyone. I know Asian is a very broad umbrella, and I don't want to rope everybody into this. But the idea that in the U.S. consumer's mind, pretty much every generation has the highest level of interest in Asian food. So that means we've got a pretty strong base of interest across the board, and definitely maybe a head start compared to other cuisine types. So young and old people are really interested in Asian food. Now, I then, on the next slide, I took a look at all sorts of different Asian quote unquote food varieties. So, you'll see everything from, ramen or Japanese food to soy sauce egg roll. So this is a number of different countries. But if we look at all those different varieties of Asian food, Chinese food has the highest affinity in that love or like it column. It's at the very top with almost 80% of people say that they love or like Chinese food. And 96% know what it is. Right? So we've got very strong interest. Only 2% of people hate it. Very, low levels of distaste for Chinese food. So we've got a pretty nice, strong audience of people that are aware of it, they know it, and they like it. So when we're thinking about, what makes people go and get food, consumers are most likely to live near an Asian restaurant, and the other one is the regional European influence restaurants. So, typically suburban consumers are most likely to live next to these types of restaurants. So it looks, and I think what's most interesting is that urban section. And I think the takeaway from this slide is depending on where you're located, you're going to have a different audience. Urban, you're probably going to have more competition. Suburban, you're probably going to have a different type of audience there. And then rural, we see, very few people in rural locations. So is that an opportunity? I don't know. I don't think so. But it is interesting to see that, for the most part, a lot of it is based on convenience. So maybe how does a food truck play into that? But to think about where you're located, if you're located in an urban, rural, or suburban location, what type of food should you put on the menu and who are you competing against? They're probably very different. So, we've talked about where the consumer interest lies for Asian food as a whole and how Chinese food fits into that. But just in generally speaking, 63% of consumers prefer globally influenced food when they're traditionally prepared. Now, I think that's probably a loaded question that a lot of people here struggle with is like, how do we make this? We want to make this approachable for an American audience, but at the same time, we don't want to like completely, disregard the traditional cooking methods, right? Probably something, like there's Chinatown here in Chicago is preparing, pretty authentic Chinese food, depending on where you go. Or you have something like Panda Express that is probably, designed to be a more broadly appealing. So it's kind of, where do we go here? A lot of consumers say that they like the traditional preparation method. And I think what happens here sometimes, maybe it's lost in the messaging where, hey, call out that this was traditionally prepared, or hey, this has been, we've been cooking it this way for 20 years and this is our signature dish. So I think some of these things that you could call out on the messaging to let people know, hey, this is prepared in a traditional way. If you don't do that, then don't worry about it. Don't call it out. But if you are, it is something to maybe brag about a little bit to get consumers interested. And if they're going to seek out, a traditional restaurant, consumers are more likely to probably pick an independent restaurant when they're just generally seeking something new outside of like a burger and fries. They're going to probably try to find an independent restaurant for that. So we are competing also against other independent restaurants, but at the same time, we're not competing against the major chains if you are, a smaller sized restaurant. So in this lens of, why you're making decisions about where you're going to eat, where does, Chinese food play into, fine dining? So this question is about fine dining. Which of the following cuisine types would you consider to be inherently upscale or fine dining? And, we didn't say Chinese specifically, but we did say Asian cuisine. And we did see that Gen Z and millennials are significantly more likely to consider Asian cuisine fine dining or upscale dining. So, depending on where you are or what type of food you're serving, maybe there's a way to lean into that premium quality or halo with younger generations. I think really it's all in the messaging and deciding if you want to, lean into more of a premium brand or, hey, we've got this traditional approach. Something to think about, I think. And what's interesting with a group like this is, everybody, there isn't a one size fits all. Hopefully there's some elements of this presentation that are pertinent to you that you can take away, and other things that maybe you're like, hey, this isn't a fit for what we're trying to do. And that's totally understood. So here's just an example of something that we captured. 18% of consumers have tried salted egg as a flavor. 14% consumers love or like it that have tried it, and it's less than 1% of restaurant menus. One of these things that, a couple publications have tried this, and they're like, is this the next big US trend? I don't know if it is, but I think things like this that lend themselves to Instagram, that are kind of niche and exciting, really do get people buzzed. And it's like, whether it's this, maybe it's more of a traditional tea ceremony, whatever that thing is that gets people excited, I think is an interesting thing. Now, if you do that with everything on your menu, then nothing is interesting. But if you have something signature that you do really well, it's definitely, whether it's a unique flavor or an item that's a signature dish, something to definitely talk about to gain buzz and to get people's interest and attention. So on this next slide, trying to gain people's attention and trying new things like salted egg flavor, right? So what is guiding consumers when they're thinking or encountering something that's new, right? So we know that Chinese food is widely and largely popular, but even within Chinese food, maybe there's some flavors and things that they've not tried before. So what is guiding these people? So I think first and foremost, if it's something you've never tried before, what's going to be something that you're like, oh, this smells so good, or this smells so bad, you're immediately either trying it or not trying it. There's also visually appealing. Now, some of this stuff is just inherent to whatever you're cooking, but there are things that maybe we can tweak, right? So familiarity with ingredients. That doesn't have to mean that you change the ingredient, but maybe you talk about the ingredient differently, or more of an approachable way, as opposed to, maybe in a way that, the general population wouldn't understand. Or providing some education on how to eat that item, right? If it's that salted egg yolk, do you pop the whole thing in your mouth in the bun? Do you pop it open? Do you let it run out onto the spoon? How do you eat it? So, telling people, hey, this is a cool process to eat the food. This is how you're supposed to traditionally do it. That could help people try new foods and flavors and get people interested. And then also, whether it's on the packaging or the menu description, again, kind of listing out what it is so that people know what they're going to get into, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to spend my hard-earned $15, $20 on this item. I want to know what it is. I don't want to have a bad experience. So these are some ways that we can overcome, disinterest with maybe new items or flavors. So the ease of pronouncing it and unfamiliar food is actually really not a deterrent to people. But actually, a third of consumers did say that, they are slightly concerned if they don't know how to say it or unsure what it is, that it might be a turnoff. So in this example, on the next slide, this is from a data set where we capture every new item and introduction from the top chains. And obviously this is a banh mi sandwich, which is not Chinese food, but I think it does a pretty good job of illustrating what this point is about messaging and talking about the food in a way that lowers that barrier from someone to try it. So if we look at this, we see these composite scores based on purchase intent. So the banh mi chicken wrap, the West Coast banh mi sandwich, they have very, pretty low purchase interest scores. The banh mi burger has an even lower. The highest one is called a Saigon chicken sandwich, right? So they actually don't call it a banh mi from the beginning. And a lot of consumers, and this is probably more important if you're a bigger brand, right? And you're trying to get a lot of consumers in the door as opposed to a smaller brand trying to be super specific. But, from the Atlanta Bread Company, they call this a Saigon chicken sandwich. Consumers know what a chicken sandwich is. It really has the same components as all the other dishes here, maybe not the burger, but all the other components are the same, but it had a much higher purchase interest score. So it definitely tells us something about how we talk about menu items, not just, what goes into those items, but how we talk about them in our messaging and on our menus really does play a role in if people are going to be interested or not. So that's kind of the middle section, and we'll come into some more specific, I think, Chinese food trends here as well. But I did want to kind of set the stage of, there are ways to get people interested. What is turning people off? What is turning people on to try new foods and flavors, and where Chinese food kind of fits in that mix. But looking specifically at menu trends, this data comes from our data set of menu data that comes from over 5,000 restaurants, where every year we're looking at this to see what kind of mentions go up or down. And I think there's some big picture things that we need to take into account just related to this past year. So when looking at all the menu data, what we observed was that menus shrank during COVID by 10.2%. So that's all menus. And typically when things come off the menu, that's due to, it's not selling well, or maybe, people weren't interested in this item. But a lot of this menu shrinkage was due to the fact that, operational costs, food waste, streamlining their menus, these had nothing to do with foods and flavors. It had everything to do with operations. That's why a lot of these menus shrunk. And something that we also saw, we talked about earlier, is delivery. So consumers saying that 66% of consumers are going to order delivery as much in the next year, or excuse me, we're not going to order as much in the next year. We'll see. I guess this was fielded during the middle of the pandemic, so things might have changed at this point. But almost a third of people said they're going to continue doing delivery and ordering online because, it's a new habit that they're interested in. I think these numbers are much higher than if we looked at this pre-pandemic, where maybe these numbers would be a lot more tampered down. And then something that I think is interesting, and I think we should talk about, is the idea of a drive-through or a pickup option. As people, depending on where you're located, are maybe not as comfortable, going into a restaurant. And I think a lot of restaurants, especially large restaurant chains, have shifted to provide some sort of pickup. And I think younger generations really like the pickup option because they can order ahead of time. They just show up, they give them a credit card, or maybe it's already in the system, and then they just pick up the food and leave. There's less human interaction, which seems like younger generations like. So I think that's a trend we're going to continue to see, is more pickup, more drive-through, more of that type of. So, how does that impact our dining space? Do we need as big of a dining room if a lot of people are going to shift towards delivery and pickup? Probably not as much. Or conversely, what do we need to do to the dining room to get people to come in? So those are kind of some of the trends that sit on top of what's happening with menus. And what we're seeing here is a list of menu penetration. So this means, the percent of Chinese restaurants that have these items on the menu. So if we look at Chinese restaurants that have these items on their menu, the most popular thing is fried rice, sweet and sour, kung pao. These are menu terms that are very, very popular. And we can see here, some of these shrank over the course of time. And obviously something like with mushroom, that's in reference to, a dish that includes mushroom or includes something else. So a lot of the classics here, this is probably not surprising to many people. On the next slide, we can actually see some of these things like Yang Chow is growing at 27% over the last 4 years. So there is some growth to that menu item. I would say that, hot pot is probably a little tougher. A lot of those places have closed and been impacted by the pandemic. And on the last slide, you'll see a couple other ones, something like honey chicken is growing on menus, and the idea of rice bowls. And I think a lot of this has to do with delivery. You can put everything in a bowl and it's easy to deliver. We also see the proliferation of fast casual restaurants. So, a lot of times everything is put into a bowl, it's customizable, it's easy to deliver, it's easy to pick up. So we are seeing a lot of bowls growing, not just in Chinese food, but all over the menu. Pretty much anything you can put in a bowl, people are trying to do now. So again, we're going to maybe shift gears here, but thinking about the upcoming holidays and the menu, right? So what do consumers associate? And LTO is just a limited time offer, means it's kind of a special promotion, something that, they offer only for a short amount of time to get people excited. And what are the top, holidays for, I always get a pumpkin spice latte from Starbucks when it gets, into the fall. So people really excited about Thanksgiving specials and flavors, or I think Christmas is probably another big one for the Chinese restaurant industry. As a lot of places are shut down, this is definitely an opportunity. So I think it's interesting to look at, this list and say, are there things that we can, specials that we could build our menu around? Is there a Halloween special? Is there a Thanksgiving special? We'll look at one of the, I think an interesting idea that a local Chicago restaurant has done around Thanksgiving. But this is an interesting thing to think about. How do we promote our menu to take seasonality into account. So we're taking seasonality into account. We're kind of understanding menus have shrunk. Some of the more popular items on Chinese menus in general are fairly flat. There isn't a ton of growth there, probably because they're pretty popular in general. But also, how do we engage consumers more on an everyday basis? And I think it's interesting to note that 19% of millennials, younger generation, already pay for some sort of restaurant subscription or service, right? Whether they're like part of DoorDash or a local restaurant has some sort of loyalty or subscription program. I think some a chain like Panera launched a coffee program where if you pay a monthly subscription, you get unlimited coffee. I think this is an interesting thing that might have a lot of potential to say, hey, look, if you give us $20 a month, you get, I don't know what it is, right? Maybe it's you get tea once a week. Maybe you get whatever that item is. Consumers, especially younger consumers, are very comfortable paying, signing up for an annual subscription. Sometimes it's hard to cancel those things. So I definitely think it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure we have seen the end of that kind of thing. I think it's just beginning. I think subscription models, people are going to try more and more. Restaurants are going to try more and more to take advantage of people's interest in subscriptions. So thinking of ways to maybe get inspired by, a lot of this is just data on a screen, but what does this look like in practice? What are restaurants actually doing that, I would say is maybe an actionable use of some of these insights? So on this next page, this is a restaurant. These are mainly Chicago restaurants. So I'm based in Chicago, so I use local examples. But this is a place called Southport Grocery. There's also a Middle Eastern restaurant right around the corner from me called Sultan's Market. And basically, it's a full-on restaurant, right? They do dine-in, delivery, pickup, but they also have a small retail space. And a lot of the retail things, especially at the Middle Eastern restaurant around the corner from my house, you can buy like the ingredients they also just use in the back of the house. So it's like, if they're not sold at the front, they'll just take them to the back. It's almost like putting your pantry, the shelf stable part, at the front of the house, which I think is maybe an interesting way to get people, hey, maybe there's cookies, or maybe there's an ingredient that I can't get at the Walmart or another grocery store, but you have got it because you use it in the back of house. Why not sell it at the front of house? And people walk by it on the way out. So I think there's an interesting way to do that doesn't look too, like you're at a grocery store, but it just looks like it's an interesting way to do that. There's a Spanish restaurant around the corner from my house that also does this with Spanish wines and a lot of canned seafood, actually, that is Spain is known for. Things that you can't get at the grocery store, but you might make a special trip, or on the way out from visiting the restaurant, you pick something up. The next example is from Sunwah Barbecue here in Chicago. I went here like last weekend and ate so much duck that I thought I was going to explode. But they have an event, and I think this goes back to looking at those, holidays that consumers get excited for. They do a bring your own turkey. So their specialty at Sunwah Barbecue is Peking or Beijing duck. And if you bring your own turkey, or you can have them buy a turkey for you, they will prepare the turkey, which a lot of times is very dry. They'll prepare it like they do their duck, and you can pick it up on Thanksgiving Day and have your own Thanksgiving with a Peking style turkey. So I think this is a really cool way to capture the interest of people that get excited about promotions around certain holidays, right? So there's definitely a lot of holidays that we could think about. What kind of offers could we do to get people interested in coming to our restaurant around those certain times? And then finally, this is another example, again, here in Chicago, called D Cuisine. And we talked a little bit how regional cuisine, a lot of people have a very specific interest in this. And again, this probably goes along the lines of a food truck as well, where D Cuisine serves, they serve a lot of different food, but really, this is like their homepage of their website. It says artisan dim sum, right? So artisan, it says, hey, look, we prepare this, traditionally in-house, and it's dim sum. It's not like everything across the menu. It's saying, hey, look, we have a specialty here that you should come here for the dim sum. We have fried rice. We have all the other great cuisine. But we really have a strong specific focus. And this helps us, I think, stand out when people are looking for, maybe it's a specific food or a specific region. Because of the advent of the internet and Google, it's not the same as when people would say, I think I want Chinese food. Now with Google, people can get very specific. They go, I want dim sum, I want noodles, I want bao buns, I want something very specific. They don't just Google, I want Chinese food. So, having something that is an area of expertise, an area of signature, like a dim sum, I think is a great way to stand out compared to other restaurants. So in conclusion, we'll talk maybe about some just key thoughts. I know this is a lot of data, a lot of information. And again, not all of this is going to be applicable directly to you and your brands, but I think there is some things that you can pull out of here. And these, I think, are some of the top things, right? So younger consumers, number one, they're not like every generation. Gen Z is different, right? They have different preferences. They're more open to trying new things, more exciting things. They're more diverse. And so they like to try new stuff just because it's new. And they also value things differently because, they're willing to pay $5 for Starbucks, and they think that's a great value. If there's a premium or, you can show that, hey, we've got a really good dish like dim sum. Hey, there's a value in that. I'm going to go out of my way to get that specific item. And then looking at delivery, competition is increasing due to COVID because of the change in which people are interacting with delivery. From burgers to third party, pretty much anything's available at anyone's fingertips at any time. It's no longer just pizza and Chinese. So definitely something to keep in mind. And how do we stand out, among the other new competitors? Maybe it's just reminding them that, hey, our food really travels well, and it's going to show up hot, and we just do it better. Consumers love Chinese food overall, so this is a positive note. And especially, something to think about maybe moving forward is like, what is the specialty within, maybe it's emphasizing that you do really great Cantonese, or you have the spiciest Szechuan food. I've got a favorite Szechuan place around the corner from my house, so when I want to have something spicy, I really go to the Chengdu impression, which is not far from me, to get that spicy fix. Especially, again, younger consumers more interested in those regional styles. So how do we innovate to drive craveability? Do we use like seasonal angles? Do we focus on a signature dish? Do we lean into regional cuisine? How do we get someone to scroll or drive past other restaurants, whether they're American restaurants or European restaurants or Thai restaurants? How do we get them to drive past there and go to your restaurant or order from your restaurant? How do we drive craveability? Something to think about. And then also, how can a small tweak in the message clarity or relatability increase interest, right? So, they come in your restaurant and, this is something awesome that you think, hey, why don't more people order this? Maybe there's an opportunity there to tweak the messaging to make it more approachable, or to show people, hey, this is how you eat or consume this special dish, that gets people more interested and maybe builds a bigger check. So that's a lot of information. I probably talk fast. I'm sorry I don't speak Mandarin, but hopefully these slides will allow you to kind of maybe reflect on some of this, and hopefully, especially these key thoughts, I think are really the takeaway here. So that's all I have. But if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. I don't know where we are on time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, there's a tons of information for our participants to take in. To be honest, you have covered like 4 to 5 different topics. But of course, our CEO, Amy, she has her own questions for you. Amy, please go ahead. We have about 6 to 7 minutes to do a quick Q&A session.
Thanks, Ian. I've actually, heard of you a lot from Henry and from the previous talks, and give us a lot of good ideas. And I've learned a lot from this part about the how people are interested in the food that are traditionally made, and maybe they will be more willing to try these dishes. Can you give us more examples on that? Because, for example, when you mentioned, for example, those easy to make bowls that make more people better understand what are in it. But for those kind of bowls, actually, it seems that it's not that traditionally made. When we talk about traditionally made, it's more, talk about authenticity and other stuff. So
yeah, no,
I think maybe elaborate more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really good question because, a lot of times consumers will say one thing, right? If you ask consumers, how often do you visit McDonald's? Oh, they say, oh, I never visit McDonald's, but they sell like 1 billion burgers every year. So we know that people, say one thing, but do another. So I think what that means is traditionally made is really up for interpretation, right? So it is really more about the messaging. And I think, something like the D cuisine example that I used with, artisan made dim sum, it gives this idea. Now, American consumers generally don't know if it is traditionally made or not. But if you say, hey, look, this is how it's made traditionally, I think, that is a way to kind of overcome that barrier. I wouldn't call it a barrier, but maybe push past, hey, can I get this anywhere? No, you can't. We actually this is our signature dish. We make it in-house. It's traditionally made. But something like bowls are growing. I think bowls, you could do the same thing and maybe there's an ingredient on there or a preparation method that you could include to make bowls more authentic. But generally, we're seeing increase of bowls on menus really due to the convenience more than the traditional interest, right? And I think that's an impact of COVID and delivery and fast casual as opposed to, the traditional interest.
Got it. Yes. From my understanding, I think what you mean is we can pick up more simple but still authentic message and deliver to the audience. Because you also mentioned that actually people will be more, interested in the message that they are familiar with, and they will be more easy to understand. As I don't know if you know how much about Chinese food, because it's so complicated if we talk about, different type of cuisines and different regions. But I think,
I think that's an opportunity though, right? I think that's an opportunity because of the complexity.
Yes, definitely.
That's definitely an opportunity. And I think sometimes Chinese restaurants, and again, I don't know, I have as much knowledge as you do about Chinese restaurants in your pinky as I do in my entire body, right? Like you guys know so much more than I do. But I think that is an opportunity that, people like regional cuisine types and they like to try new things. So, instead of just saying, Chinese food, hey, I want Cantonese or I want Szechuan, and the complexity of all those different
right.
You can almost like by explaining what it is and the heritage of it, you can get people interested and excited, especially younger consumers that want, more of an experience. So I think it's an opportunity, but at the same time, I understand that is a tough message to communicate without, you don't want to make it polarizing where people are not interested, but at the same time,
yes,
you want a unique experience.
Great. Thanks a lot. And I think some of the audience want to know more about how the data is collected. For example, one friend is asking.
I do like one of these questions here. I think there is a stereotype about the price of Chinese food. And I think what's interesting here is, I think, Chinese food is oftentimes, people expect a lower price point or a portion size to be huge. And what's funny, the other like American or European food that also has a similar expectation is Mexican food, right? It's tough to find fine dining level of Mexican food. And so I think there's a very similar issue there where and just recently there's, I think 2 or 3 now, more fine dining Mexican restaurants here in Chicago. I know Rick Bayless has launched some of those. There's one called Mitakoya. And I think there are a few here. And I think in that one slide, we saw that, younger generations are more open to considering Asian food in general. And obviously Chinese plays a role within that as fine dining. So, I think really, how do we change that perception? Do we call out the premium ingredients? Like, hey, this is pork from a very specific farm, like the way that fine dining talks about their pork.
Yeah.
Right? Schlegel Farms from Colorado, and we flew it in every day, right? You're building a premium story. If you just put everything on the menu with just a name and maybe a couple words, people are like, okay, this is like every other Chinese restaurant. So in order to build that premium price point, people have to believe that, you know, it came specifically, right? I mean, I've been to a restaurant on the West Coast in Vancouver where I don't know if it's true or not, they could be lying. They said they flew in the duck every day from Hong Kong or something. And I was like, whoa, I'd definitely pay a lot more money for that. They fly it in every day, right? Seafood restaurants do this all the time. They're like fresh catch, right? So it's not even the food itself as much as how we message and talk about the food to command a premium price.
Wow, that's amazing. Because yeah, I know we have really limited time, and thank you so much, Ian. But I wanted to add something. I think the telling story part is definitely what Chihuo is doing. So maybe we can discuss more like how to introduce the Chinese food stories to the mainstream market. And thank you, Ian, so much, Ian, and appreciate that. And maybe Henry, you can continue on the next.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. Obviously, if anyone's ever in Chicago, come say hi. Henry, we'll talk later, but I appreciated the time, everybody, and good luck with the rest of your conference.
Oh, by the way, thanks, Ian. Is there any like promotion going on? For example, anyone that wanted to keep in touch with you, you can leave any contact. I think that would be great. Yes.
Yeah, I'll leave my in the chat. I'll leave my. I probably should have put this on the last slide. Shame on me.
Yeah.
I just dropped my email in the chat to everybody. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I don't have all the answers, but I'm happy to give my perspective, a limited perspective that I have. I really appreciate you all. I think it's a really challenging year, and you know, kudos to all the people out there that are, you know, I'm looking at the data. That's a lot easier position than actually being in the kitchens in the back of the house and doing this every day. So kudos to everyone that joined, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Henry，你刚好 mute 了，所以